So today we're talking about Games Workshop's Player's Code for Warhammer, some genuinely good sportsmanship thoughts for when you're commanding armies across the tabletop. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking about another Games Workshop document, their Player's Code, a short list of principles just to help guide people play more sportsman-like games of Warhammer. It does come from the Age of Sigmar 3.0 rulebook, but to be honest, nothing within it is particularly relevant to just Age of Sigmar, and it's very generalizable to 40k, or to be honest, even from other miniature war games not necessarily bought from Games Workshop. To be honest, I think they've done really quite well with it. A bunch of statements that it's kind of hard to disagree with if you're playing any sort of reasonable game among friends, and I think it's a helpful guide for newer players and more experienced generals alike, as playing games of Warhammer really are quite nuanced affairs. With such a complicated game going on, there's actually really quite a lot of ways that you could gain advantages over the opponent or just make the gaming experience a lot less pleasant for them. In my experience, the vast majority of people who play in 40k do tend to be really nice characters anyway, but no one's perfect, and I think that everyone, including myself, will fall foul of some of these rules from time to time, so I think it's quite nice just to have them as a general reminder and maybe just make them a bit more prominent in your mind when you're playing games. With all of that said, let's actually take a look through it. We'll go through all of their principles, and then maybe talk about a couple of things that aren't on the list that they might have thought about including. So the cardinal rules that they have here above all others are be polite and respectful, and tell the truth and never cheat. I think two things that are very hard to argue with, and both things that are generally going to be a good idea in life, let alone in games of Warhammer. Being polite costs you nothing and is generally going to make the other person like you more. And if you do go into every game of Warhammer lying about rules and cheating wherever possible, you're rapidly going to acquire yourself a reputation and probably not find games quite as easily. From there we have a fairly long list of principles. Firstly, arrive on time with the things that you need to play. Very sensible advice there. If you turn up without a codex or are needing to borrow people's dice or tape measure for every movement, that could get a bit annoying. And not leaving your opponent hanging around for 20 minutes pre-game is definitely a good way of not wasting their time and helping ensure that you'll actually get the game finished. They then advise making a respectful gesture towards your opponent before and after the game, such as offering them a handshake or wishing them good luck. Kind of feel like it was an interesting choice to immortalise the word handshake in print. There's certainly been a lot less of that going on whenever I've been playing 40k due to all the recent virus concerns, but obviously the principle's still a nice one. Either with a handshake or some sort of similar gesture, it shows that you're going to be respectful of your opponent and you're kind of acknowledging that it's just a game, and however things turn out on the tabletop, you still respect each other as people. There's avoid offensive language, kind of makes sense. Then request permission for unpainted or substitute models, which I think is an interesting one to be honest, seeing as at least in 40k you are almost specifically allowed to use unpainted models. It just gives you that minus 10 point penalty at the end of a game. Again, I would say that it's more of a question of sportsmanship really. I think very few people would actively decline games because you happen to have a few models unpainted within your army, or might be trying out one different model as a substitute, but I think it's kind of nice to make people aware of that, and to make sure everyone's on the same page before you start. The advice showing army lists pre-game, again that is pretty basic, walking your opponent through the army and saying exactly what your relics and warlord traits and any complicated stuff does, and then be prepared to answer any questions about your army's rules. Warhammer isn't supposed to be a closed source game where people don't have access to information, but just because of the enormous scope of the rules, it does mean that people won't be able to grasp every nuance of other armies, and a few basic questions can really help them not do something very silly on the table. Maybe things like pre-game moves, intercept abilities, or heroic interventions in Warhammer 40k. Next we have measure distances carefully and accurately. That's definitely something that can be quite frustrating if you're seeing someone do it wrong on the other side of the table. Often if they're just moving their models like an inch or so more than they should be able to, it can feel really quite picky to actually call them out on that. It's definitely a lot nicer to be playing against someone who just measures them right in the first place, and it makes things less awkward in general. With dice rolls, they don't say all that much other than allowing your opponent to see dice rolls before you pick up the results. Rolling dice rolls where they're clearly visible is really handy, and it just means that you can definitely trust the results if your opponent's seeing them as well, and just guarantees that you're preventing one way of cheating, such as in that recent high-profile case where one of the top ITC players got banned for a bit, partly for rolling his dice behind some high terrain and then picking up more dice than he should have done. Next there's ask permission before touching your opponent's models. Not a bad idea at all given how much time, effort and work goes into Warhammer 40k miniatures. gives the other player a chance to say if there's any parts that are more fragile than you might expect, if they prefer you to only handle them by the base if possible, and obviously just gives the first player the thought that maybe they shouldn't be handling the other person's models if they've just been eating a bunch of greasy food. Next, there's an interesting one: remind your opponent about forgotten or incorrect rules, and particularly so if you're reminding them to your opponent's advantage rather than your own. Correcting incorrect rules is most certainly the honest thing to do, even if it would disadvantage your opponent by the way that they're incorrectly playing things. I feel like the forgotten rules thing is maybe just a little bit more debatable. I've talked about that a bit in the past, say if your opponent is setting up their models within an intercept abilities range, like you'll have models coming in from deep strike and are about to get shot off the table by Auspex scan. Do you remind them that that stratagem exists, or do you just allow them to set up their models in an unforced error? In more casual games, it might be sensible just to remind them that that exists at the time, or at least make sure that you've clarified to your opponent that all of your infantry squads can use Auspex scan if they happen to deep strike close by. And even if you've just mentioned that at the start of the game, then it means that your opponent can't really claim that they didn't know about it. In higher end competitive play though, there certainly are those of the opinion that if your opponent makes errors, then they should just basically own them, and it's all part of the skill of playing 40k. I guess it depends on your own personal philosophy of gotcha moments. In any case, it seems that Games Workshop would much rather you remind your opponent than just let them make those mistakes, judging by the guide that they've written here. Next we have never deliberately waste time during the game, where I guess this is kind of calling out slow play. Generally, whether you're playing casually or at a tournament, time is not finite, and by slow playing and making a game end early, sometimes it could massively advantage one army over another, particularly say an army that was going to get tabled by the end of the game, but they might be able to hold enough points in the midfield to actually still win on turn 3 if they can force their opponent not to play the last few turns. Playing against opponents who deliberately slow play really is quite unpleasant, and it definitely seems like a good principle to have on this list for everyone's sake. Next we have an interesting one: avoid distracting an opponent when they are trying to concentrate, and be careful to respect their personal space. Essentially, don't try and mess with your opponent's head or intimidate them to try and gain an advantage when playing model soldiers. It's not one that I've really seen discussed all that much, but it certainly seems very sensible to me. Next we have never complain about bad luck or opponent's good luck, which I think might be a little bit arbitrary here. Again, it's certainly something I've touched on in the past. It can be just a little bit dispiriting if your opponent is just moaning about dice rolls the entire game long. Sure, sometimes a particularly poor shooting phase might swing the whole outcome of a game, but unfortunately that's just the way it goes sometimes. Dice games are always going to have an element of luck, and if your dice aren't rolling particularly hot, it doesn't really make sense to make that your opponent's problem and ruin their enjoyment of the game. Still, I'm not sure I'd say never ever complain about a bit of bad luck. I think people are always going to bemoan their dice rolls once in a while, and that's kind of fine. I think it's just important not to do it to the detriment of your opponent's enjoyment. Finally, and perhaps just a little bit ambiguously, never fix the outcome of a game. I'll be honest, I'm not entirely sure what they're getting at here, whether they're meaning by list tailoring to utterly destroy your opponent's army, or cheating when you're recording your victory points or something. Obviously it's a good rule in principle. Any game that you turn up to should certainly have the opportunity to go both ways, with the chance to either win or lose, but I think that the wording on this one might just be a little bit vague. I'm not 100% sure how I'd practically apply that. I guess maybe it might be intentionally vague to cover a range of different situations. So overall, I think that player's code is really quite a good and comprehensive list, though maybe there might have been a few other things that I think that they could have thought about including if they'd wanted to. Maybe a bit of a word on list tailoring, not just knowing what your opponent's taking in advance and taking the exact counter to it. That's not going to lead to a fun game most of the time. They could maybe have been a bit more specific on other dice roll things, maybe things like declaring intent before you roll, and perhaps having a consistent policy on cocked dice. If they don't quite lie flat, either just re-roll all of those, or you can go down the route of just re-rolling the ones where the result isn't clear. They don't mention anything about rules disputes here. I suppose it might be covered elsewhere in the rulebook, but usually that can be sorted out by first checking the rules, any FAQs that are relevant, and if that fails, consult any nearby impartial third parties, or just rolling a dice off with your opponent, the winner getting to choose the way that a subtle wording of a rule is played. I think maybe one principle that might fit in quite well with their code would be to take both victories and defeats graciously. If you win a game, then don't just spend the entire time gloating to your opponent and talking rubbish on their army, and if you're losing, don't just sulk and whine about game balance, and keep the other player's feelings in mind. Finally, they could perhaps have mentioned general hygiene as well. Gaming clubs do have the potential to get a bit sweaty and musky at a time, and as I mentioned in my That Guy Guide to 40k video, Using any of your own chemical emissions to mess with your opponent's decision making is quite poor sportsmanship indeed. So let me know what you think of their general principles, if there's any subtleties that they might have missed, but in general I'm quite positive about them. It certainly doesn't hurt to have these fairly salient in people's minds, and printing them at the front of a rulebook will certainly do that. If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the Warhammer 40K videos coming, with new ones coming out pretty much every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying regularly, I would just like to mention that the channel has a Patreon page, which is how I can keep so much of this content coming so much of the time. If you are enjoying regularly, any support is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry to the regular prize giveaways, with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description below. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.